The U.S. ambassador to the Philippines describes the country as a hub for sex tourism and then apologizes. Too late to stop renewed debate about the issue. Who's to blame for the practice of sex tourism? Host countries or the tourists themselves? And what are the limits of ambassadorial speech? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Mike Hanna. Speaking at what was a public function, the U.S. Ambassador, Harry Thomas Jr., expressed the opinion that 40% of male tourists visit the Philippines for sex. In his apology, he expressed regret for his comments, saying specifically he should not have used the 40% statistic without being able to back it up. No reference to the broader issue of the Philippines being described as a hub for sex tourism. But the apology has been accepted by the presidential office, which says there will be no formal complaint against the ambassador and it considers the matter to be closed. Not so, say activists who've been campaigning against the sex tourism industry. Let's begin with this report from Marga Ortigas in Manila.
Though prostitution is illegal, it thrives where tourists are known to gather. Many don't put a spotlight on the problem. There's a deep contradiction having the sex trade boom in a country known as the bastion of Catholicism in Asia. But the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines did just that when he recently addressed a forum of judges and government officials. Ambassador Harry Thomas said, quote, "We know that 40% of foreign men who come to the Philippines, including from the U.S., come for sexual tourism. That is not something I'm proud of. That's not something you should be proud of." End quote. This is one of the most notorious tourist sites in the Philippines, frequented by many foreigners not so much for the beach, but the barely hidden sex trade that flourishes here. Aside from women, many of the sex workers on offer are children. It's a taboo subject rarely discussed here, but those who are trying to fight it are glad for the recent boost their cause has received thanks to a U.S. diplomat's controversial comment.
It's public knowledge that prostitution is so widespread in the country. It is being tolerated even by many local government units because they are earning from the taxes of prostitution establishments.
Ultimately, concerned groups agree that the underlying problem here is poverty, with some 30% of the population having to live on less than $2 a day. There will be those who feel they need to sell themselves or their children for sex in order to survive.
Public opinion has also been split, with many feeling the ambassador just called it as it is. Government officials don't want this to affect their original plan of giving the tourism industry a boost. The goal is to double the number of visitors to 6 million by 2016. They only hope it's an increase in the right sort of tourist. Marga Ortigas for Inside Story, Manila.
Well, joining us now are our three guests. In Manila, Amihan Abueva. She's the Regional Coordinator for Asia Against Child Trafficking. She's also the chairperson of ECPAT. That's an organization fighting against the sexual exploitation of children. In Hong Kong, Mark Thompson, a professor of politics and director of the Southeast Asia Study Centre at City University of Hong Kong. And in London, Aidan McQuade, director of Anti-Slavery International. Welcome to you all. Well, the apology that we heard there appeared to be about the statistic rather than the wider issue itself. Let's begin in Manila with Amihan Abueva. Your view on this?
Well, I think the ambassador certainly made a mistake by citing a figure which is really very difficult to prove. All we have are the indirect statistics that would list the number of men, unaccompanied men, who come to the Philippines. But I think the bigger issue is that we have to acknowledge that sex tourism is a big problem in the Philippines. And on the other hand, we need to remember that the roots of sex tourism in the country also stem from the large presence of U.S. military troops, especially during the time of the anti-Vietnam War. So the sex tourism is certainly a big concern, but I think Ambassador Thomas should rightly also, acknowledge the role of the United States in helping to make this industry grow.
Well, Mark Thompson in Hong Kong, that particular point there about a responsibility from outside parties such as the US itself. We had the specific mention made there of military bases within the Philippines as a contributory factor to the sex industry. Your view?
Well, that's certainly true. The sex industry, which of course existed before the Vietnam War, which was already mentioned, grew by leaps and bounds during that period. It also grew during the Marcos dictatorship in the 1970s and 80s, where tourism was stressed, and that's where a lot of the sex tourism picked up. And when the U.S. bases were removed in the early 1990s, some of the places where the U.S. military had been based were still used as places where sex tourism took place. So the legacy is clearly still present.
Well, Aidan McQuade, just to set a context here before we get into the specific issues that we'd like to discuss, we have already heard that this is not something that is without precedent. It is not something that is here and now. It is something that has a strong historical base.
That's right. I mean, but in relation to the issue of sex tourism and trafficking, I think the Philippines is caught in two ways. On one hand, you have people coming to the country for the issue of sex tourism. On the other hand, the poverty of the country is such that the Philippines exports tens of thousands of its own people into trafficking for things such as domestic servitude and forced labour. So we're seeing two aspects of this particular problem concentrated and having a dreadful impact upon ordinary people in the Philippines. And I think one other thing to recognise in relation to this is whenever we're talking about the problem, we're not just talking about poverty being a cause of it, but also a means by which people who are used and exploited in this way are dehumanized by those who exploit them, whether they're children or women. And so therefore there is a responsibility on the governments of countries, for example, which are receiving Filipino workers into those countries to work, hopefully in decent work, or the citizens who are who are going to the Philippines for sex tourism. There's responsibilities upon them in order to impose some appropriate law and order on their own citizens.
Well, a lot of issues there that we'll discuss, but let's pick up on that first one with Amihan Abueva, the question of poverty, the internal issue within countries like the Philippines of that massive poverty that plays such a contributory role to the sex industry. How important is it to combat poverty as a primary step to combating the sex trade?
Well, poverty is certainly a very large factor, but of course poverty is also caused by things like very unequal trade, a problem also of there's also a big problem, for example, in the concentration of wealth within the country. I mean, we have many poor people, but we also have a very, very significant number of people who are so rich. So there is a problem of concentration of wealth and the lack of opportunities for many people. But we also have to look at the systems of trade and also the collapse of many manufacturing industries in the country, which has also led to a shortage of jobs.
Well, Mark, Thompson in Hong Kong, carrying on this particular point, we're looking at outside factors involved here economically. The collapse of certain industries within the Philippines, the point that we heard there about the use of Philippine expatriate workers in other countries, outside countries having a responsibility for this very question of poverty itself.
Right. Well, I'm here in Hong Kong, and of course there's a huge Philippine population in this city. Many of them domestic workers, and this is, of course, in large part driven by the fact that these domestic workers, largely women, don't find adequate employment in the Philippines. They come to Hong Kong often overqualified for the jobs they do. So clearly poverty plays a role. Globalization has affected the Philippines very strongly. As has been mentioned, the Philippines has lost a lot of important industries. On the other hand, it's gained new employment, for example, in the call center industry, but that's the kind of employment that you have to be better educated for. So there's been a gap between the Philippine economy, which is growing again and doing better in recent years, on the one hand, and on the other hand, continued inequality, in particular difficulties with access to education. I think an additional factor that's also been mentioned, but it's worth saying a little bit more about, is the issue of corruption. And the current government, the the government of President Aquino has stressed how important it is to fight corruption, to get the Philippine economy, the Philippines as a country going again. And this affects this question of the sex trade, because corrupt officials, corrupt police and so on have turned a blind eye to this. So the government's policies, which to be fair have always been quite strict about sex tourism, have had difficulties when it comes to implementation.
Well, at this point, let's take a look at some details. According to the 2010 U.S. Department of State's report on trafficking in persons, the Philippines is a source, transit and destination country for human trafficking. The report said that, and I quote, "The government of the Philippines does not fully comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. However, it is making significant efforts to do so." And in this year's report, the Philippines is moved off the State Department watch list and upgraded to a Tier 2 status that recognizes the government's efforts to combat sex trafficking while maintaining that more still needs to be done. But the U.S. Justice Department maintains that even when legislation is passed, it is ineffective, because on many occasions it is not enforced against tourists, and the department also raises the issue of police corruption in particular countries. It says, and I quote, "Efforts to combat child sexual exploitation often run into conflict with foreign governments' efforts to promote the international tourism industry. Police corruption is common," it continues. "In Thailand and the Philippines, police have been known to guard brothels and even procure children for prostitution." Here we have these official reports bringing up that issue of corruption and bringing up that issue of the conflict between the need for tourism and the sex industry itself. Aidan McQuade, I'd like to bring up this particular point. Is there a conflict between tourism, bolstering an economy, and the sex industry?
Well, I think what you're seeing in the Philippines, and the dispute over the 40% mark is interesting itself, because what that tends to indicate is that the issue is not being adequately investigated. The fact that they have a dispute about this statistic means that the issue is not being adequately investigated to such an extent that you have got hard, reliable statistics and everybody can agree on the scale of the problem. I think that speaks then to the question of institutions. So on one hand, we're seeing, as Mark, our other colleagues mentioned, some quite good policies on the part of the Filipino government, but then a failure of those to be implemented. So it's difficult to make the will of the government run through the country while the institutions themselves are weak. I think this then speaks to international governments as well, because if we're talking about, we must be able to know, or know very easily, who are the people who come to the Philippines as tourists. And we should be looking at those countries where they're coming from and asking, do those countries have extraterritorial legislation which would allow their citizens to be prosecuted if they engage in the rape of children overseas?
Well, this is a critical point. Clearly, the U.S., for example, has the U.S. Protect Act of 2003, which does allow for the prosecution of Americans who conduct sex crimes abroad. Mark Thompson, though, is there sufficient international legislation in those countries that provide the tourists to give an added muscle both to the host country and to those countries that the tourists come from?
Well, again, there is some good legislation out there. I think another country worth mentioning is Australia, in which there's been a lot of consciousness raising recently, a lot of discussion about tourism, and the Australian government has been very active in that regard. Crucial, I think, is the cooperation between countries where the tourists go and countries where they come from. And I think the Philippines, again, has done pretty well in that regard, working with the Australians, working with the Americans and other countries. And there have been a few high-profile cases. But again, it always gets down to the particulars and the particular areas that are notorious for even child sex, and nothing is done because a corrupt official covers it up. The Philippine press is active. NGOs are very active in the Philippines. So there is an ongoing battle, as it were, between those who would try to do more on this issue and those who have an interest in covering it up. International legislation plays a role, but without cooperation of local authorities, it's very difficult, of course.
Yes, to pick up on that particular point concerning Australia, last year there were 19 Australian tourists on one particular occasion refused entry because of their sexual conduct records. But that wider issue, Amihan Abueva in Manila, the question of whether or not the government is actually doing enough, not in terms of passing legislation, which it has, but in applying legislation, which some claim it is not. Do you think that this is the case, that it is not practicing its own legislation strongly enough?
Well, the country is a really large one. I mean, what the policymakers are saying in Manila is that we do have excellent laws protecting children, but the problem is the implementation. And what we've found is that we really have to go from city to city, from tourist spot to another, just to make sure that the authorities and the owners of resorts and hotels are aware of the laws. I mean, the Senate, Congress have passed a lot of good laws, but the problem is very little effort still to make sure that at the city level or the particular resort areas that these laws are actually disseminated and enforced, and that people know where to go. So that's often a problem. Sometimes people report cases to us, but when we report them back to the police, it seems that sometimes police don't know what to do.
Well, to stick with you on that particular point, Amihan Abueva, is it a question of they do not know what to do, or is it a question of there being an innate corruption within some of the police departments?
Well, it's probably both, because I would think that it would be impossible to have really large-scale sex tourism without the complicity of key government officials, especially the key officials within the police forces. But when it comes to the policeman on the beat, the person who has to respond to the cases, oftentimes you have a problem that they really don't know what to do. And we actually have to help them know where they have to report and so on, and what kind of evidence has to be gathered. So it's a big problem, because on one hand, there's this policy, but on the other hand, you have a lot of police, which are still very macho, who still think that it's a very minor problem, and they're often also on the take.
Well, Aidan McQuade, in London, earlier on you brought up that question about the dehumanization of people who are subject to the sex trade, who become part of it against their will. This issue of dehumanization, is this an internal issue? You said it's something that the government should address, or is it something that is far wider than that?
It's much wider than that. If you look at the history of slavery over the course of human history, in fact, there tends to be a combination of, in order to establish systems in which people will be exploited, can be exploited, there needs to be a myth around those people, describing them as something that are less than human. And the whole growth of racism within Western culture is probably the most classic example of that. But just to go back a little bit to one of the points Abueva was making in terms of policing and corruption, it reminds me very much of a debate about community policing and democratic accountability of policing within Britain and within Ireland over the past maybe 20, 30 years, where one of the central problems that we began to see was because of the significant power which police have, there is always a risk of corruption in any police force, unless there is proper democratic accountability of those police forces, where they're responding not just to central government, but also to the local communities they're meant to serve, and particularly the most vulnerable communities in which they're meant to serve. And so there may be, therefore, as a challenge as well to those who are providing aid to the Philippines and to other countries, which is to talk about how to develop those sort of democratic institutions, and particularly how to ensure that there's democratic control of those powerful institutions within society, so that they use their power in order to protect the vulnerable rather than in order to profit for themselves. Because whenever you see within those institutions attitudes towards women, attitudes towards children, attitudes towards poor foreigners, to treat them as something which is less than human beings, to treat their abuse as something which is a minor crime, as Abueva was pointing out as well, then you're into very, very serious problems in terms of implementation of law and the very practice of the rule of law itself.
Well, Mark Thompson in Hong Kong, let's just pick apart some of those comments that were made there. That issue of race playing a part, the issue of people being more vulnerable because of their race in certain circumstances, because they are regarded as inferior by one society or another. This is just an indication of how massive this problem is it not?
It is indeed. And I would add another factor, and that is, of course, the importance of class differences. I think it's hard for people in the industrial world to understand how grave the differences are between rich and poor in a country like the Philippines. But it's of course not just the Philippines, it's many other developing countries which have similar problems also with tourism in this regard. So there's a disconnect that goes on there between the upper and lower echelons of society. There is a growing middle class in the Philippines that's been benefiting from some of the economic changes, has been benefiting from globalization, but there's an increasing marginalization of those at the bottom. And in the case of the Philippines, society is like a pyramid, and the bottom of society is very large. So I think this issue of sex tourism sort of shines a light on the issue of not just of poverty has been mentioned, but the class differences that get reproduced over generations. To be fair, again, the current government is making efforts to come up with some very basic welfare measures, and of course some institutional reforms we've talked about, particularly in regards to the police. But there's so much to be done, and the problems are so massive. But that this, as I said, just kind of illustrates the larger societal problem faced by such developing countries as the Philippines.
We also heard that point, Amihan Abueva in Manila, that democracy itself is a very potent weapon against institutionalized corruption, against the abuse of individuals. Is there a consciousness of this within countries like the Philippines, that democracy itself is a weapon to be used against such abuse?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, the civil society organizations in the Philippines have been very active, and we work with the basic principle that we really have to mobilize the communities, that people themselves have to become aware of the problem so that they can guard against the difficulties or the dangers that are brought about by sex tourism. What we've found, for example, in working with communities in Bohol, one of the major tourist destinations of the Philippines, is that people are really genuinely interested to protect their children. They just need to know how and what to guard against. So I think it's really very crucial that when people at the community become very concerned about this, they can put pressure on the local government officials and the police to do their jobs better. And I think it shouldn't be a contradiction to increase the number of tourist arrivals, because it's the difference is what kind of tourists do we want to attract to the Philippines. And I think we have enough attractions in the Philippines to attract the families of tourists, not just the male tourists to come to the Philippines.
Mark Thompson, would you like to pick up on that particular point, that tourism is not incompatible with development, and is certainly not compatible necessarily with the sex trade?
Well, indeed. And I mean, one thing that's important to note about the Philippines is I mentioned earlier, during the period of authoritarianism under Ferdinand Marcos till the early 1980s, tourism was stressed and it grew quite rapidly. Then the Philippines had a series of political crises. There were coup attempts. Marcos was overthrown. There were a series of coup attempts, and tourism went down. Most recently, it's gone back up. And I think, you know, there are efforts by the Philippine government to attract people to a country that is now much safer than it used to be. The infrastructure is better. And I think another point is that the role of non-government organizations can't be stressed enough in the case of the Philippines. I mean, we've talked about the weakness of institutions. We've talked about corruption. We've talked about the problems of poverty. But on the other hand, we have a very dynamic civil society in which groups are active, not just in Manila, but at the grassroots level, and they're active in this issue of tourism as well. So with growing community involvement, and I think issues like this, so the blow up over an ambassador's comment has the advantage of refocusing energies in terms of looking at this particular issue, and it's also an indication that when foreign governments want to make a difference, one of the things they can do is provide more support for NGOs that are involved in issues like these.
Well, an issue that one must emphasize is not just relevant to the Philippines, but to a vast spectrum of countries across the globe. But thanks to our guests in Manila, Amihan Abueva, in Hong Kong, Mark Thompson, and in London, Aidan McQuade. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.